years, Clash Royale spells have shaped the battlefield, defining metas, crushing towers, and even sparking outrage until they were, finally nerfed. But at their peak, some were so absurdly strong that they feel unreal today. So let's turn back time and revisit every spell at its most broken state. Because trust me, did you guys even notice what I wrote? You naughty little fellas. Some of these were downright unfair. When thinking about strong spells, one of the first ones to come to mind absolutely has to be the log. It's been nerfed quite a lot, and still remains extremely powerful and versatile. It's a cheap spell that can counter the Goblin Barrel, Princess, Dart Goblin, and a whole lot of other cards for a positive elixir trade. On top of that, it's able to knock back any ground troop and reset charge attacks from cards like the Prince and Battle Ram. But that wasn't always the case. When the log was first released in 2016, it was one of the worst legendaries and even one of the worst cards in general. It was unbelievably slow and felt clunky to use. The rolling distance was also quite short, and the biggest difference was that it couldn't knock back all troops.
Nobody
played the log, and its weaknesses were obvious. This caused the balancing team to add some changes to the log to try to make it worthy of its legendary status. The first buff was given on the 24th of August in 2016. This would nearly double the casting speed of the log, allowing you to drop it quicker. On top of that, the rolling speed was also slightly increased, meaning that if you tried hitting a target on the enemy side of the arena, the log would travel there a bit quicker. These changes definitely were a step in the right direction, but the log was still a weak card, and still didn't have anything about it that could justify its legendary status. The log didn't see a big increase in usage rate, and so within a month, the log was given a buff that would forever change the way we perceive the card. The balance change allowed the log to push back all ground troops by 1.5 tiles. For comparison, the log currently has a knockback of 0.7 tiles. It was more than double back then. This change was massive. The knockback could make the Prince and Dark Prince restart their charge, and it could also cause cards like the Royal Giant to retarget. The log was pretty decent now, and it finally had a unique ability, making it worthy of its legendary card status. But the balancing team wasn't done cooking just yet. 1 month after the knockback buff, the balance team increased the casting speed once again, as well as the rolling speed, allowing players to use the log more reactively. The rolling distance was also increased by a whopping 2 tiles, going from 9.6 to 11.6 tiles. This absurd range allowed the log to take out a Goblin Barrel and then roll all the way to a Princess standing at the bridge and take her out as well. And to top all of that off, the log was given a damage increase of 8.5%. Something definitely worth mentioning is that during this time, the log dealt 40% damage to crown towers as opposed to the current 20%. That meant that a log at its lowest level would already deal 104 damage to the Princess Tower, whereas today, it only deals 85 at level 15. This was, without a doubt, the peak of the log. From this point onwards, the log would only become weaker and weaker from nerf after nerf. But the log's strongest state wasn't just the best version of the log. It was the best card, period. With a near 80% usage rate, it was absolutely everywhere. It could take out swarms, deal good damage to other troops, reset charges, and even take out flying units. Okay, I might have lied about that last part, but the log was undoubtedly the strongest card at that time. Despite not being very good or providing any real value, the clone spell is one of the most loved spells in Clash Royale, especially when you're running a Goblin Barrel mirror clone deck in 2v2 with a friend. But how strong was the clone in its strongest state? Well, let's look at how the clone spell was when it was first added. A pretty big drawback to the clone spell was that it would reset your own troop's charge. If your Sparky was fully charged and you decide to clone it, the original Sparky would have to charge all over again. Not only that, cloning troops would also take 0.8 seconds instead of the current 0.5. Something that wasn't very useful either was that the cloned units would spawn next to the original, whereas now it is behind the original, giving it that extra bit of protection. The other buff the clone spell has received was a radius buff, going from 3 tiles to 4. But does that mean that that was its strongest state? I don't really think so. We need to look at the environment the clone was in, because even though the clone might not have been buffed, the environment could indirectly make it stronger. So what could I be talking about? Well, we've seen the clone perform really well inside Golem Night Witch decks, but we've also seen some glitches allowing clone to shine a bit. We've had a Lava Hound clone glitch where cloning a Lava Hound would result in normal lava pups, but do you remember the double Guardian glitch with the Little Prince? If you timed it just right and activated the Little Prince's ability at the same time as you cloned, you would get 2 full health Guardians for the price of 1, and there are a bunch of other glitches involving the clone spell, but none quite as strong as these ones. So the real strongest state of clone, it's kind of for you to decide. But personally, I gotta go with that Lava Hound glitch. It was just insane. A card that will be pretty easy to decide its strongest state is the freeze spell. If you think the current freeze is annoying now, oh boy. I wouldn't say you're wrong. I 100% agree that it is still an annoying card to deal with. But what I'm trying to say is that there were times when it was a lot worse. But I'm gonna freeze that point there really quick. Don't worry, it's just to ask you to, subscribe to the channel if you can. It's free and it helps me out a ton. Seriously, it means a lot. Appreciate it. Anyway, back to Freeze. The strongest version of Freeze by far, bar none, was its first rendition. On the 4th of January 2016, the Freeze peaked. It had a 4-tile radius and at max level, froze for 8 seconds. Sure, it didn't deal any damage, but boo-hoo. You literally had a freeze double the length of today with a bigger radius. Absolutely insane. The Rage spell, added on January 4th of 2016, was the complete opposite of Freeze. It started off very weak and then has just been continually buffed over time. Originally, it cost 3 elixir and dealt no damage. And while it had a much bigger radius, that didn't stop it from sitting at a 0% usage rate for years. Eventually, it was buffed to cost only 2 elixir, and it had its moments with elite barbarians, but that wasn't its strongest showing. For the most part, Rage remained weak and wasn't really viable in most decks. The only times it saw play were when an overpowered card was dominating the arena, as Rage could enhance that card's strength. That's why in 2022, Rage received a complete overhaul, one that would put it at its strongest state yet. Its radius was reduced from 5 to 3 tiles, its duration was set to 6 seconds across all levels, and a half-second deploy delay was added. On the surface, these were all nerfs, but to compensate, Rage was given the ability to deal area damage. This completely changed how the spell functioned. Instead of just helping you win harder when you were already ahead, Rage could now clear out a skeleton army surrounding a Sparky while still boosting attack speed. It could help your tower one-shot goblins and minions and still has similar effects to the old Rage spell. It became an extremely viable card and honestly might be one of the stronger spells in the game right now. We saw it be a menace alongside Ram Rider just a few months ago. And even outside that deck, it's still been solid overall. It's like Zap, but instead of stunning, it boosts attack speed. Speaking of Zap, what was its strongest state? There are a few ways to approach this. You see, Zap used to one-shot even stab goblins, allowing it to fully counter the Goblin Barrel. Not only that, but it also had a full 1-second stun. Essentially a mini freeze. And on top of that, it dealt 40% damage to crown towers instead of the current 30%. Seems pretty clear that this was Zap's strongest state, right? Well, yeah, but I did forget to mention one crucial thing. Zap's stun didn't affect the Inferno Tower. Despite this, it was still an extremely useful card. Since its introduction in 2016, Zap has only been nerfed. So does that mean that the 2016 iteration was the strongest state? Well, I'd say so, but if we consider the evolved Zap, you might change your mind. The evolved Zap was absolutely busted on release. Deploying it gave you 3 zaps for the price of 1, and not just any 3 zaps. With each consecutive strike, the area damage grew larger. This meant something like a Sparky or Inferno Dragon would get reset a total of 3 times. The first version of the evolved Zap also had no damage drop-off, meaning it could take out troops like Mother Witch and Magic Archer. So depending on whether you consider the evolved Zap a separate card or not, the strongest version is either the original 2016 Zap or the evolved Zap at launch, and thank God that got nerfed. Another 2 elixir spell with an evolution is the Giant Snowball. At launch, it was quite weak and received a few buffs to help it out. Nothing major, but enough to make it viable. However, the strongest version of Giant Snowball might just be its current state. Its last balance change came in 2023 when its slow duration was increased to a solid 3 seconds. You might underestimate Giant Snowball, but with the help of your Princess Tower, it can fully counter a Goblin Barrel and even a Wizard. Despite not being overpowered, I believe its current state is its strongest. Giant Snowball isn't as strong as I initially expected, but since the evolved version was introduced after its latest balance change, the current version is the strongest either way. Now that we've been talking about the evolved Zap and evolved Snowball, let's go ahead and talk about the last spell with an evolution, that being the Goblin Barrel. The most changes made to this card were in 2016, but the last change in 2016 was removing the impact damage and decreasing the elixir cost from 4 down to 3. And from this point onwards, they only ever received damage nerfs and some hit speed nerfs. So honestly, the 2017 version must be the strongest version of the card, but we of course have the evolution that we gotta talk about. The Goblin Barrel evolution was added on the 3rd of June, 2024. When deployed, a second Goblin Barrel is launched alongside the first one, which lands on its mirroring tile in the other lane. Once the second Goblin Barrel has hit the ground, it spawns 3 Decoy Goblins. The Decoy Goblins have extremely low health, but the same damage as the regular Goblins. At first, the evolved Goblin Barrel was perceived to be quite weak, because it was pretty easy to tell the real one. Players messed around with the evolution a little bit more and realized that as long as the Decoy Goblins are tanked for, it's pretty much the same as a normal Goblin Barrel, and so split lane pressure decks with the evolved Goblin Barrel emerged. All of a sudden, it was impossible to tell which Goblin Barrel would be real and which one wouldn't, because, well, you're getting pushed in both lanes. In January of 2025, the Decoy Barrel was given a visual effect for a brief moment to tell them apart. So the strongest state of the Goblin Barrel would have to be its initial evolved version, or the 2017 version. For the rocket, it is extremely easy to tell the strongest state. Ever since its release, it had no balance changes other than crown tower damage reduction. Over the years, it's gone from 50% down to 25%. Gladly so, because Expo players would have a field day with the 2016 version. So the initial 2016 version is clearly the strongest version, as it simply dealt more damage, and that's what the rocket is really for. The only thing the 2016 version is missing is the goblin riding the rocket. Another card that barely had anything changed other than Crown Tower damage is the Fireball. The Fireball has suffered a bunch of damage reduction on Crown Towers as well, but also had a different nerf that was quite substantial. In 2022, the Fireball's knockback was decreased from 1.8 tiles to a simple 1 tile. That knockback was nearly halved. So the Fireball 2 would have its best version in 2016, as here it would still have its 50% damage to Crown Towers instead of its current 30. Now, onto a spell that has gone through a lot of changes. The Tornado. If you show a new player the way the Tornado behaved in 2016, they would be starstruck. It used to last an outrageous 3 seconds, had weaker pulling power, and it couldn't deal damage to buildings. The current Tornado is absolutely great at making win conditions switch lanes, pulling troops off towers and activating your King Tower. But the old Tornado was excellent at stalling time for defense and clumping units together for easy splash damage. We've seen how effective both Tornado versions can be, but the old version might have been the strongest state it had ever been in. The Executioner combined with the Tornado, or ex-NATO, was incredible at stopping even the biggest of Golem pushes for only 8 elixir. And it's not like the old Tornado couldn't activate the King Tower, it just wasn't as quick, and you couldn't really do it without sacrificing some hit points on your Princess Tower. I don't think that the balancing team gave the Tornado a rework because it was too weak. It was given a rework to fit into more decks, and mainly because it was too strong with things like Executioner and Magic Archer. But the Tornado spell isn't the only spell that was given a rework. Remember the heal spell? Yeah, before we got introduced to the Heal Spirit, we had the Heal Spell, but the Heal Spirit wasn't the only rework. The Heal Spell used to actually be very strong, but only in one instance, that being healing the Three Musketeers. It was pretty much useless in every other deck, but the amount of value it gave in aiding the Three Musketeers was beyond anything we had seen before. For only 3 elixir, it could undo the damage a fireball or poison had done to the Three Musketeers. It was later reworked to try and make it fit into different decks. It was reduced in healing, but it was also given a lower elixir cost of 1, but all that resulted in was the heal spell falling in usage rate even more. Which is why I'll have to put the original 3 elixir rendition of the heal spell as the strongest state, as I won't be counting the heal spirit because, well hey, it's not a spell. On to the Graveyard. The Graveyard was released in 2016, right before Halloween. It had a bigger radius, which is arguably worse, but the way the skeletons spawned was more random. This allowed some skeletons to spawn a lot closer to the tower and sneak in a quick hit, even when there was poison right on top of it to take out the skeletons. The duration also used to be 10 seconds, whereas now it is 9. No major changes, but the extra second allowed the Graveyard to spawn just a tad bit more skeletons. The first version of Graveyard was probably its strongest, but let me know what you think in the comments below. I really love seeing your thoughts, and I read all of your comments, so be sure to share your opinion. The Graveyard isn't the only spell that spawns a troop though. Moving on to the next spell, the Royal Delivery. The Royal Delivery is an area damage, air targeting spell with a medium radius and moderate damage. It can be deployed on the player's own side. Once the spell has hit the ground, it spawns a single Royal Recruit. You might think it's decent now, but when it was released, it was a lot stronger. This was mainly due to its ability to deal knockback, and not just a small bit either. The Royal Delivery would knock back troops by a full tile, making it great at delaying pushes and stopping a ram rider or battle ram from charging onto your tower. Right after its release, it was given a 27% damage increase. This was later nerfed by a bit, and then eventually the knockback was taken away. So the strongest version would without a doubt be the version with knockback and the 27% damage increase. It was perfectly capable of dealing with a ton of different troops. The damage and knockback alone would usually be enough to stop most units, which meant that you would also have a Royal Recruit with full health and a shield to counterpush. Another card that allows you to counterpush with a troop is the Barbarian Barrel. Similar to the Log, but shorter, narrower, no knockback ability, and less damage. So why use it? Well, it spawns a barbarian, as the name implies, but this wasn't worth it for the first few months that it was out. This was because the Barbarian Barrel used to cost 3 elixir. Sure, it at least dealt knockback, but not to all troops like the Log. So when the elixir cost was changed to 2 elixir, the Barbarian Barrel was gonna be able to get some value. Not even a month after the elixir cost reduction, the balancing team gave the Bar Barrel another couple of buffs, increasing the casting speed, rolling speed, and the speed at which the Barbarian would spawn. This was, without a doubt, the peak of the Barbarian Barrel, so much so that people started replacing the Log for Barbarian Barrel, and Log had never, ever been bad, other than the first few months of its release. The Barbarian Barrel didn't get any nerfs to its width yet, nor did it receive any damage or spawn time nerfs. It did nearly everything the Log could do, except deal crown tower damage, on top of spawning a Barbarian that could help defend or attack. Next up, we have the Barbarian Barrel. The Barbarian Barrel is a spell that... Wait, we just did this one, didn't we? Oh, it's a mirrored Barbarian Barrel. Wait, so does that mean... Oh, right! Sorry, the next spell we'll be taking a look at is the Mirror. Sorry, I got a little carried away there. Anyway, the Mirror is an interesting card as it allows you to play the card you just played for +1 elixir, 1 level higher. But when was Mirror the strongest? The answer is really not as simple as you might think. You're probably thinking of the level 16 incident, where Supercell buffed the Mirror to add 2 extra levels to the mirrored card, and now this was surely one of the strongest showcasings of the Mirror, but I'll let you in on a little secret. In January of 2016, Mirror worked by replaying the last card you used at the same level as your mirror, with an added cost of 1 extra elixir. Elixir. However, level scaling wasn't properly considered when designing Mirror. A level 4 Mirror would spawn a level 4 Rare and a level 4 Common, even though a level 4 Epic was equivalent to a level 7 Rare and a level 9 Common. This meant mirroring commons or rares wasn't ideal, but for epics, it worked just fine. However, looking at the February 2016 patch notes, we can see that Mirror had a major bug. When a player used it, they actually got back the extra elixir they had spent. This made Mirror unbelievably strong. As long as you were mirroring epics, you could play an overpowered card again without any drawback whatsoever. So, what do you think stronger? Playing a card again with 2 extra levels for +1 elixir, or playing any epic card again for the same elixir? I personally have to go with the extra 2 levels, but that's only because the other version wasn't practical with commons and rares. Otherwise, it would have been great. Speaking of great, goblins. Man, I love goblins. And what better way to make goblins than by using a Goblin Curse? The Goblin Curse was released in its strongest state by far. The reason it was so good wasn't even because of its ability to turn troops into goblins. It was because of the damage amp. Currently, the damage amplification is 20%, which is pretty nice because, well, it lets your troops deal 20% more damage. But before this, the damage was amplified by 35%, and before that, it was amplified by 50%. 50% extra damage for 2 elixir. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the area radius was 4 tiles instead of the current 3. Pre-nerf Goblin Curse was easily the strongest state it had been in. Even if it didn't turn anything into goblins and dealt 0 crown tower damage, it would have been amazing simply for allowing you to deal 50% extra damage. Another spell that has some amplified damage is the Earthquake, as it deals nearly 4 times as much damage to buildings compared to troops. Depending on what you would use Earthquake for, your opinion might differ from mine. Though I think most of you will agree that you want to be using the Earthquake to take out buildings. Before any balance changes, the Earthquake dealt 300% damage to buildings as opposed to the current 250%. It used to slow down movement speed by 35%, whereas this is 50% now. Though now the Earthquake has no attack speed or spawning slow. The old Earthquake did have this. It also dealt massive damage to ground towers, but it couldn't hit a Tesla underground, even though, this is an Earthquake. So the current Earthquake is good at dealing with buildings and decent at dealing with troops, but the Earthquake was great at dealing with buildings and okay at dealing with troops. Though if you ask me, its main purpose is clearly to take down buildings, which is why I'll have to say that its original version would be the strongest state for the Earthquake. The Earthquake isn't the only natural occurrence though, because next up is the Lightning spell. The Lightning on release was decent as it could take out pesky troops like the Wizard and Witch, but a much needed buff was given 8 months after its release. This being the ability to stun and reset enemy troops for half a second. Just like Zap. This was crucial for players that needed to reset an Inferno Dragon, Inferno Tower, or Sparky. After this buff, the Lightning, much like other spells in this video, got its Crown Tower damage nerfed over and over. So to pick the best possible version, we'll have to go with the one right after the stun buff. This one still dealt 40% Crown Tower damage, and the stun was incredibly powerful in Golem beatdown decks at that time. So the Lightning worked great with the Golem, but Poison worked great with the Giant. Look at me with my impeccable segues. Anyway, the Poison was extremely strong with the Giant. Strong to the point that people literally called the meta the Goizen meta. Now you might be wondering why the Poison was so good with the Giant. Well, the Poison used to last 10 seconds instead of 8. The same damage overall, but spread out over a longer period. Now, what exactly made that so strong? Well, it wasn't the damage, it was the slowing effect, and it wasn't just decreased movement speed either. Their attack speed was also decreased, similar to the Ice Wizard. All the while, it's dealing fireball level of damage, protecting your giant from skeletons, minions, and other swarms. Though, was this the best state of Poison? It didn't one-shot skeletons yet, so it wasn't as reliable at countering Graveyard, but Graveyard wasn't in the game yet. And let's be real, if meta is literally named after a card, it's pretty safe to say it was the strongest state for said card. Now, this card didn't have a whole meta named after it, but it certainly was meta. The Void was impeccable at taking out support troops for a positive elixir trade. For 3 elixir, you could take out a 6 elixir Sparky, which was honestly just ridiculous. The single target damage was way too strong, and it was too quick to try to block the damage with another unit. Yeah, it was terrible at taking out a bunch of skeletons or minions, but the amount of value you get when you use it on other support troops was insane. Did you know that the Evolved Wizard, Ice Wizard, and Electro Wizard are responsible for creating the Void? This can be seen in the Clash Royale Void intro video. Anyway, I know we're not doing miscellaneous facts in this video, but the initial Void was easily the strongest version of the card, and it was seen in nearly every deck. One of the simplest spells in the game. No weird magic in a bottle, natural disasters, or any of that. The arrows, despite being simple, have definitely had their strong showings throughout Clash Royale history. The strongest they've been was without a doubt the moment they got buffed to deal 3 volleys of damage instead of 1 in 2019. This would allow arrows to deal very well with the clone spell, guards, and any other swarmy cards. It also dealt more crown tower damage back then, but they've become more of a necessity recently. Statistically, the arrows are worse now than back in 2019, but I'd argue today they're in a stronger state. With cards like the Evolved Firecracker, Evolved Bomber, and Evolved Wallbreakers, the arrows have become a must-have in a lot of decks because the Log and Zap simply can't deal enough damage to take those cards out. Now, there have been other spells like the Warmth spell and Party Rocket, but these were only temporary. And while we're on the topic of some powerful cards, you need to check out this next video where I take you on a full journey to prove why Golem is the greatest tank in Clash Royale history. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. Click it now, and I'll see you there.